what was it about the mid 20th century that produced so much good fiction? Right? There's something about that time period where we go to the science fiction writers of the time, the fantasy writers, and before then too. But I think, like you said, Garrett, it hit its nadir at the mid 20th century. Right? We have Ray Bradbury, Asimov, Tolkien, Charles Williams was still. I mean, you could even throw like not just like G.K. Chesterton, some of his fiction works from a little bit earlier than that. But you hit so much good fiction that was so deep, so well done, so original, and we're not getting any of that. So two questions then that I thought would be interesting to kind of dive into. One is what was it? And Austin, I'm sure you have some input into this here. What was it about the mid 20th century that produced so much good fiction, at least in my opinion, or maybe I'm wrong? And the second question is, will Hollywood ever make anything good again? Will we get anything? Like, it feels like everything is a retread. Even when you look at like the popular shows on Amazon that are good, like Jack Reacher was fun. There's that one with Chris Pratt. That was good. But all those are stories other people wrote. They're not creating themselves anything new. They have to go to other people to get it. Even the Tom Clancy one with Jim from The Office. What's the name? I can't remember. It was
John Krasinski. It was the Jack Ryan series.
Jack Ryan series. Yeah, right. But even that is going back 30 years to almost 40 years.
I mean, it's like what I was reading in junior high, right?
So, Austin, I'm going to first go to you because you're more in that and you've researched that and you've talked about it, I think, in some ways. But maybe what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is a difficult question. So I'm going to sort of come about it from a circuitous route, and maybe we can get somewhere. So with Tolkien and Lewis and those sorts of people, at least in that circle, they live in the mid 20th century, but they're raised in Edwardian England, and they're raised in a conservative culture in Edwardian England. So if we want to talk about their thought world, where's their thought world coming from? It's coming from the Victorians. It's coming from the late 1800s. I mean, remember, Tolkien's born in 1892. He was 8 when Queen Victoria died. Like, he could remember her. So I think especially those particular authors, we have to look maybe further back than their current culture to understand what's shaping them. And if we look back into what's going on and most of these are British authors. I can't think of any like really impactful American fiction authors of the time, but that's not my specialty. They're reacting to
Faulkner, Fitzgerald.
So Fitzgerald's got his own issues. But I mean, Faulkner, we can talk about Faulkner. Like, what's going on with the British fantasy writers of the early to mid 20th centuries? They're all reacting to late Romanticism. And they're all reacting to a particular concept of the imagination, which is influenced by guys like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth, John Ruskin, William Morris, all those folks that have a larger vision of how society, the individual, God, nature, art, all of these things fit together. So there is a unifying, coherent worldview that they inherit. And nowadays, we have no unifying, coherent worldview. We don't even have a unifying, coherent American culture.
Right.
But why does having a coherent, unifying culture bring great art, bring great stories? What is it about that births that?
So I think part of it is it helps you understand plot better. Right. It helps you understand what matters and what is lasting. Because you have a built-in, almost like a natural law, like a natural ordering of value. But secondarily, like if you read George MacDonald's essay on fairy stories in his book, in his collected essays, A Dish of Orts, and this is one of the things that Tolkien was in when he was writing his draft of On Fairy Stories, which is his sort of manifesto for how to do fantasy. MacDonald says that all of the images and symbols that we draw upon in our own works of fiction are intended by God, right? God has put this deep well of symbolism and meaning into the world for us to find and use. So it would not be the same if Aslan were a baboon or if he were even a tiger, right? There are particular like divinely intended meanings for these things, and we tap into them when we use them. It's not the other way around. It's not that we're imbuing these symbols with meaning. It's that we're finding the pre-existing meaning that's sort of being brought out. Now, metaphysically, whether you want to buy into whether that's true or not is beside the point. These fiction authors did think it was true.
Yeah.
And so Tolkien says, when you're looking for fairy, you tap into this deep well of power within the universe. Like, go back to On Fairy Stories, read some of his drafts. He talks about it, like drilling down into this this like underground ocean of meaning, of power. And where does that come from? Like, if you don't have a relationship of God to society, then you don't have any image of like what would a worthwhile quest even be. If you don't have a vision of, if you don't have a vision of the human person and of what it means to live an excellent life, how can you have a character arc, right? There's all sorts of implications that are downstream of these sorts of questions.
And what you're saying is at that point in time. Okay, I'm wrapping my head around that to figure out. So that's a part of it, I think, and the other thing that we brought up was, so where do you think the pain of the first half of the 20th century, in the sense World War I, World War II, plays into these great stories too? Because you were talking about how having a character arc, or knowing what is true and good, and digging into the deep wells. Well, if you've never had to dig deep because you've gone through horrible experiences and the pain of losing many loved ones, many friends, of seeing destruction and gore really through that, like, how does that lend itself to what we got in the mid 20th century with these stories?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is the fact that they know what real evil is like, and they have actually experienced resisting it and the dangers of what resistance means. Like, it's not one thing or the other. Tolkien is very explicit in his letters that he has seen orcs on both sides of the war. So, I mean, Tolkien is a war author. Lewis is a war author. Charles Williams is least affected by the war.
To go back to your original question, Jonathan, about why you had these great authors at this period in time, I think you have a couple of things. What Austin was saying is so true. When it comes to, they were inhabiting kind of a cosmology, a literary cosmology that was from a time previous to modern time. Lewis wrote The Discarded Image. Tolkien is drawing from all these other story arcs and various things from old myth and the old stories. But at the same time, they've read Jane Austen. They've read the modern English novel. The idea that you can take these kind of abstract things and then bring them into real life in this kind of like that kind of fictional world that you would find in Austen, where it's more like grounded. Which is, I just read an interesting paper last week about how, and I talked a little bit about this last time. The Scouring of the Shire is kind of transitions to the form of the English novel. Like right at the end of Lord of the Rings, it's been epic, it's been everything else, but at the end it transitions. It becomes about the home, and the great villains are kind of shrink down to now they're like Fagin from Dickens, or those other kind of Dickinson characters. And so you see that transition. I think that's what made them so good as writers, is they kind of blended those two things. They have these old archetypes and these old narratives that they're now bringing into a way for us to receive them in that kind of narrative novel form. And you see that especially in Lewis, more so than Tolkien. So he kind of remains that epic.
I think another point worth mentioning too is, and it goes along with both your points, I think, but it's an important aspect of the whole ethos that's driving these good authors, at least the ones that we like. Coming out of World War I, there was a lot of cynicism about the human race in general, about what we were capable of achieving. And a lot of writers responded to that by making stories that were just grim and cynical. And I think a lot of really horrible things happened in World War I. So the darkness is understandable. And I think people like Tolkien and Lewis wanted to also stand up to a lot of that cynicism that was popular among their own circles in the day.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Like the role of optimism in these authors cannot be understated. I mean, Chesterton has it too, even though he's a little earlier. Like Chesterton encapsulates his optimism because he went through like the dark night of faith in his art school days. Like he had an existential crisis and he became a nihilist and became suicidal, and then he worked through it. And this goes right back to this. So there's two streams of romanticism when we're going back to history. There's two streams of romanticism that sort of split. And like the Wordsworth, Coleridge, Ruskin, Morris stream that goes into modern fantasy because it embraces optimism. And then you've got like the Byron, Shelley, other stream that goes into develops Gothic literature and eventually horror. And that
like the Kurt Cobain romantics.
Yeah, the cynicism, the decadence, the ennui of the universe, right? And the same sort of moment happens. You're exactly right. After World War I, and the reason why Tolkien's optimism is powerful is because it's real. It's not naive optimism. Tolkien knows what suffering is. Yeah. He is not glib about what it takes to say yes to the world, but he does it anyway. And that's a lasting impact. You know, we started off before this live stream went on the air, we were talking a little bit about Ted Lasso. And I think, like, if you want to talk about an optimistic TV show in the current day and age, like Ted Lasso is probably going to be the one everybody goes to. And the reason why Ted Lasso is powerful for the people that like it is because it's also not naive. Like, it deals with real issues of divorce and mental health and like feeling like you are in the wrong job, feeling like you're purposeless in life, and then choosing to move through all that and say yes to the world. Now, the problem with Ted Lasso is that he doesn't have any philosophical underpinning for why the world should be positive.
Right.
And that links us exactly back to this world picture, this coherent world picture.
So maybe that's why we're not getting anything great out of Hollywood because there is no underpinning to anything they're writing.
Yeah. So there's an interesting question about like why people like Batman better than Superman, for instance. And most people say because Batman is more relatable, he's more interesting. It's harder to write Superman stories because Superman is supposed to be the representation of what is good. Mm-hmm. And that changes over time. The opposite changes over time.
What changes over time is what is good.
Yeah, like Lex Luthor starts off as a mad scientist and now he's a corrupt politician, right? It's a mirror that's held up to our culture. Mm-hmm. But right now that mirror is fractured because we have no idea what goodness is in this culture. And so we cannot write good Superman stories, and therefore we cannot write very good redemptive stories unless we're tapping into something else.
Yeah, it's going to take a long time. I don't know what it's going to take for us to get these kinds of stories created again, because people aren't reading, people don't have the faith, right? It's not being passed on. People don't have the skills because they're not willing to put in the time. They're watching live streams on YouTube instead, and